Welcome to the Cleveland Bay Horse Society of North America's annual general meeting. Today, we're going to start with a lecture on nutrition, and then we'll go into our annual meeting. Margaret is secured our guest speaker today. So I'm turning everything over to Margaret.
Okay, thanks, Gabrielle. So hello, everybody. Our speaker today is Heather LAYTON. Heather spoke at another meeting for a club that I'm a member at, and she did an awesome job. And she's also helped me a couple times with my horses. So I'm happy to tell you that we get to share her information today. She's the owner of Equitrition. It's a full-service equine nutrition consulting company, and she makes recommendations based on performance goals, health conditions, and budget. She has loads of good experience in the industry, as she's worked for the Belgian equine brand Cavlar, and then began distributing in the United States. She worked with Cargill Animal Nutrition for 5 years before moving to Alltech, which is based in Kentucky. And she helped build and expand on their equine nutrition portfolio, including brands we're familiar with like Macaulay's and Mrs. Pasture's cookies. Today, she's going to be discussing how Cleveland Bays were historically fed, how the Industrial Revolution impacted feed manufacturing techniques, and how science has changed our approach to feeding today. She will conclude with talking about best practices around feeding Cleveland Bays. So feel free to ask her loads of questions. She knows everything. And take a look at her Equitrition's Facebook page too to get more information on Heather.
Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen now so that we can get the presentation up. Okay, everybody. Can you guys see this?
Yeah. Coming up. There you go.
Yeah. All right. Great. Super. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Margaret. I really appreciate it. I had a lovely time working with Margaret on her, getting her Cleveland Bay fit and looking fabulous. So I'm currently in Pennsylvania, and I am doing nutrition consulting and some rehab work through my company, Equitrition. So I'm going to talk today a bit about specifically the history of the Cleveland Bay, feeding the Cleveland Bay historically as the breed has continued in its evolution, and then focusing on equine nutrition and issues specific to Cleveland Bays. And in that portion, I would be happy if you guys took yourself off mute and just ask me any specific questions you have, if there's any kind of disorders or things like that that you're concerned about, because I didn't have a ton of time to go into various specific issues and disorders. So without further ado, as many of you, if not all of you, are breeders, I just did a quick slide here on the emergence of today's Cleveland Bay, which I'm sure everybody is well aware of, but I was not. So I thought this was quite interesting. So the Cleveland Bay breed is the oldest breed in England. It coming from pack horses called Chapman horses, as far back as basically recorded. So I found records going back to easily 14th century. As horses became more for transport, they started, well, transport and riding, they started breeding these Chapman horses with the Barb horse or Barbary horse, which came from North Africa and is now throughout mostly Spain, southern France, and Italy. And there was actually, I think it was Henry VIII in England imported 7 mares and stallions from Italy, and those started the modern day Cleveland Bay when bred with the Chapman horses. And then as the breed evolved, there was more Arab, like Spanish breeds, Arab and Andalusian influences, up into now more of like the modern day Cleveland Bay, which is, I think, a lot lighter and has more endurance than the original horse. So I looked at characteristics because I feel like characteristics helps us feed better, because you're feeding for the characteristics of that specific animal, which is really important. And so if you look at the evolution of this breed, you know, we're going from pack horses and agriculture stock, where you are really looking for a very well-muscled neck, shoulder, wide shoulder, horses that were quite heavy, but had a really good lifespan so that they got a lot of use out of them. I also thought it was quite interesting that despite the kind of draft nature of the Chapman horse, the modern Cleveland Bay was bred to have little to no feathers to avoid some of the mud fever type diseases while working in the heavy clay soil in England. And then as the carriage population needs emerged, the breed was moved into more of a lighter, sure-footed, more endurance, faster type of animal, with uniform bay coloring so that they were easy to pair for 2 or 4 in hand. This breed, interestingly, is very potent, which I did not know. So they were quite easy to breed, and they're also very hardy, so not terribly difficult to feed despite how much work they were doing in the transport industry. And they're very docile, so not something that's going to easily spook. And that was really, really helpful for these long trips people were taking and then going from the woods right into these really urban environments. They were also really, really well liked as cavalry horses. And so they typically have shorter legs in comparison to their body versus a lot of other breeds. So this was for ease of mounting and dismounting. And also their movement was considered when the focus became more of like a cavalry, specifically an artillery horse. They really wanted a specific type of movement, and a good trot was what they were looking for these horses. And then as we moved into more of like the 20th and 21st century, we were looking more for increased speed, lighter, more endurance. So you were going more into the sport horse type breeding for fox hunting. But these horses are still big enough that they could carry a 200-pound man, you know, over a half a day of hunting without a problem. Show jumping, combined driving, etc. Little bit, I guess you all know about this too, but you know, more modern breeding. I didn't realize that the Upperville Colt and Horse Show down in Upperville, Virginia, was actually created specifically to showcase Cleveland Bays. That was really interesting. And then Queen Elizabeth, after her grandfather was a prolific breeder in the 1920s, purchased the Mulgrave Supreme Stallion and is basically credited for the resurgence of the breed and keeping the breed from extinction. So when we look at history of feeding practices, and this is more what I talked about when I was at University in Pennsylvania with Margaret, really feeding horses prior to the late 19th and 20th century was very specific to where the horses were located. So what a horse was eating in Africa would be very different from what they would be eating in Iceland or the United States, like in the plains or whatever of America. So because we're talking about Cleveland Bays specifically, what I wanted to focus on was what horses in the UK were fed. And what I found was this horse bread was the #1 fed product to horses for hundreds and hundreds of years in England. Oh. So quite interesting, completely human grade. So if there was famine or the very poor would also be capable of eating this. And it was made with a wide variety of things, a lot of seasonal legumes, specifically split peas because of the protein and the carbohydrate starch content. They also would add, depending on where you were, acorns. There were a lot of oak trees, or if you were on the shorelines, they actually added seaweed. So both of those would provide both mineral and vitamin and protein. And then they used a lot of non-wheat grains. So rye, oats, bran, and it was a lot of like bran flour, bran meal that was fermented. So this was a dark brown bread, and it was, I don't think it would be particularly palatable for us today, but this is what we're fed to a lot of livestock, and particularly horses. And, you know, the middle class and upper class, you know, we're looking at, you know, medieval up through the early 19th, mid 19th century, they would eat white bread. And that was more expensive because of the refining of the flour necessary to do that. And this horse bread was so important to the English production that it was regulated multiple times by Parliament, actually, around who could make it, the distribution of it, and the pricing of it, because it was such a cornerstone of keeping these animals healthy. So really interesting. When we move more into the 19th century, and you had a little bit more industrial revolution coming into play here, in England, they would, because they don't have a ton of land as compared to, say, America, they would actually use chaff a lot, and they still use chaff to this day. So you're looking at harvesting grasses, oat straw, barley straw, clover, harvesting that and then chopping it up to a pretty fine size, like maybe only a couple inches chopped. And then what they would do is they would actually like vacuum seal it and store it. And by doing that, they would ferment it a bit. And that would add prebiotics into this forage. And that's what they were feeding as hay. Had increased calories and was considered more nutritious than just plain hay. But obviously plain hay was fed. But this was something that you could feed like over the winter, something like that, like seasonally. And in this book, I found there was actually a specific ration that would have been used in the mid 19th century, where they were mixing 8 pounds of oats and 2 pounds of beans, again, probably like a split pea, with, you know, anywhere from like 20, 25 pounds of this chaff. And that's what you would feed your horse through the day. And that's actually, that amount is pretty standard even for today's like considerations with the weight of these horses. And this would be for pretty hard work, but at that time, these horses were in very hard work. And then when we look at modern manufacturing practices, I could do an entire presentation just on this one slide. So I kept it pretty simple. But to give you an idea, 1894, Purina Mills came out with the first bagged sweet feed. And William Danforth was like, hey, look, this is something that you don't have to mix yourself. It's very quick if you have a large head of horses to feed. It's cheaper than straight oats because it was mixed with corn and molasses, but it's also safer than feeding straight corn. And this became an incredibly popular way to feed horses in the early 20th century. Pelletizing started in the United States by Cargill and then by Macaulay Brothers. And this, in the 1920s, I found some diagrams that they were using in England of pelletizing machines. So the first one was quite rudimentary. The pellet, or like the wafer as it kind of came out, was not very hard. So when they went to bag it, it would really fall apart. It wasn't super helpful. Then the second one was actually a little bit different mechanism. So instead of having like these little dots where you had to line up the spokes, and the mash went through the spoke to create the actual wafer. This was more adjoining, and it did actually create a slightly stronger pellet by doing that. And then not that much longer, we actually came into what is more of a modern day pelletizing die, where it's like a roller that is rolling out the mash and breaking it up into pellets with a flat die. So pellets became very popular as a way to feed, because again, it was more digestible versus like a whole grain that wasn't particularly digestible, like corn. And then in the 1970s, you started looking at micronizing, which is actually a heat treated process that they use for carbohydrates specifically to make starch easier to digest. And there's less of a risk of that starch passing into the hindgut by micronizing it. Now they also use puffing practices, like that's what Cavalor does, although it's patented, so difficult to find it depending on where you go in the world. And then shortly after that, extruding became a way actually to basically take the pellets and cook them and puff them, which is what modern day dog food looks like. That would be considered an extruded product. And you could find that in brands like Sentinel Feeds has that. But it's a patented process. In certain places in the world, it's not patented, and therefore it's very widely used because it's considered very safe. Like Australia, most of the feeds are extruded. In the United States, there's not that many extruding plants actually. So it's very specific to certain brands, and even brands that have extruded, say an extruded fat supplement, a lot of times it will all be made in the same manufacturing plant of a competitive manufacturer. So, for example, Mars Animal Nutrition in Ohio has an extruding plant. And so they are able to make a lot of the other brands' fat supplements that way. So when we look at the modern, like the more modern Cleveland Bay, so our Cleveland Bays of today, they're not, most of them, if not all of them, are not working anywhere near as hard as these horses were plowing fields, hooked up to carriages and used as basically taxis, or, herding on sheep farms in Australia, or even working as cavalry horses. So you have an incredibly thrifty breed that is not in a ton of work. So what we really want to look at is first the basics of understanding how to balance a diet. So understanding, hey, forage has to be number one. These horses can very, very easily get all their calories from forage. And so monitoring the amount of forage they're getting and how they're getting it, because that is the bulk of their calories, is really important. If you have to feed a concentrate, which you should really for the fatty acid vitamins, the fat soluble vitamins, and maybe the additional digestive support that's in modern day feeds, as well as the fortified omega-3s that might have been in the ancient feeding practices, but not so much in the mid 20th century feeding practices. That also is very helpful for inflammation and boosting immunity and things like that. So what we want to look at is, hey, vitamin, minerals, what are we missing out of our forage? Amino acids, is the horse really have the coat quality, hoof quality, muscle development that we want, that the amino acid would be so important for? And then looking also at, the carbohydrate load. Is it enough that the horse is able to do the work that you need them to do? Or, do we need to kind of cut it back because it might be genetically or otherwise prone to diseases where starch can wreak havoc, to be honest. And then when you're looking at feeding concentrates, it's really important also to consider the manufacturer and what their instructions are, because not all manufacturers are created equal, and a lot of that is based on weight. So if you have a sweet feed versus a pelleted feed versus an extruded feed, 1 pound of those 3 products is going to look very different in terms of volume. So you do not want to feed by volume. That is typically not a great way to go because it's not how the manufacturer's instructions are on the bags. So the manufacturers are going to list out how you should feed by weight, and it could be anywhere from 1/10 to 1.5% of the body weight, depending on the formulation type. So is it something where you're going to feed 1 pound for the whole day because it's highly fortified? Or is it something that is very high in calorie and maybe a little bit lower in fortification rate, in which case you would feed probably a 1/2 pound bare minimum per 100 pounds of body weight. So these big Cleveland bays, you're looking at a 1,300 pound horse. Okay, a regular off the shelf Purina strategy, you would have to feed 6.5 pounds a day of that to get the nutrition that's on that bag, which most people are going to say, if I fed my Cleveland Bay 6.5 pounds of grain a day, it would explode. So that's where we really want to take into account the nutrition on the bag is not the nutrition that you're going to actually be giving your horse unless you follow those manufacturing guidelines very strictly. Now I'm going to stop here because I went through a lot already. Does anyone have any questions around this type of information before we go forward? And I can't see the chat, so anything in the chat we'll just have to do at the end.
This is Margaret, and I remember we talked about this, and what I thought was different, your approach was helpful because you talked about feeding the calories, like the number of calories that go down that horse's throat is what we're looking at. That's what we're feeding. We're not feeding percentages that show on the bag if you're not feeding the proper number of pounds of feed. So, yeah, I like it helped me understand when we're talking about calories, about how much the horse should eat, and then equate that with the nutrition value based on the pounds of the feed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like you guys are, a big group of breeders, right? So let's talk about breeding specifically. So Margaret, congratulations, bought a Welsh pony, baby. Right. So, we were looking at different types of growth type formulas, breeding feeds, and there is a huge difference when you're feeding a thoroughbred that's growing versus feeding a Welsh pony that's growing. And some of these formulas, they're really mare and foal. And so they can be very, very high calorie because you're looking at feeding that to a mare that's potentially lactating and already rebred, going through a huge amount of calories. And, maybe that foal at her side is getting a little bit of this product versus something that's weaned and genetically is very thrifty, like a pony or a draft horse or a mini or something like that, where that same mare and foal concentrate is not appropriate at all for that breed of horse. So we were looking for something that was still a growth formula, but a lower calorie growth formula. And the calories, sometimes depending on the manufacturer, can be hard to find. So that's something that is really important when you're looking at the different types of horses. And then also the environment that horse is in, right? So if you look at these huge breeding farms, standard breds, thoroughbreds, they're there could be hundreds of acres that they're turned out in. So they're moving all the time. They're covering miles and miles and miles a day. So you can feed them a quite high carbohydrate ration with no problem, versus having something that's growing in your backyard that's on maybe an acre. It's not moving as much. And maybe there's a ton of grass, maybe there isn't, but that metabolic rate is going to be a lot lower. So factoring in those different things is what is going to drive kind of the equation of what you're looking for calorically. How good is the forage? How good is the hay? What type of calories are you giving them, right? Or is it a fat-based calorie? Is it a carbohydrate-based calorie? And what that individual horse needs based on its genetics and how much it's moving, whether that be through turnout or work each day. And it's not rocket science, but it's not always as easy as people make it out to be either. So let's just assume the majority of people are dealing with a very easy keeping Cleveland Bay that doesn't have an underlying digestive disorder that makes it a very hard keeper, right? So what we're looking at is controlling those calories, because like I said, 16,000 kilocalories a day, even for a large Cleveland Bay, would probably be sufficient. And most grass hays are going to clock in at about 900 kilocalories per pound. So if you're feeding, some pasture, but the quality is very, very dependent on seasonality, and maybe not a huge amount of land because a lot of us are in the Northeast, or way down south where you may not have great quality grasses, right? Then you have to look at this hay and go, okay, we're going to plan to feed 1.5% to 2% of its body weight in hay and forage a day. So a 1,300 pound horse, you're looking at 25 pounds a day of, a grass hay. And that's all the calories it needs. So, half a bale, depending on the size of the square, and assuming it's a 2-string 40 pound, that would be all it needs in calories. So we need to look at how we're going to balance and control the calories to ensure that they're continuously grazing as they should as an equine, to continue with the saliva production, neutralizing stomach acid, keeping that GI tract healthy while controlling the calories so that you can get the forage in them without making them overweight. And so really, not a super lush pasture is very, very helpful. A nibble net as it pertains to giving out hay. They even make toys where they have to really I use it a lot for minis, where they have to really roll it around almost like a dog toy to figure out how to pull the hay out so that they're actually moving and they're stimulated while they're eating. And then the type of hay, balancing your hay quality. So for a super easy keeper, mature hay is best. Like I say always, there is no such thing as bad quality hay. There is just the right hay for the right type of horse you have. If you have a very high metabolic horse, like high rate of metabolism type horse, that's also working very hard, racing, high level eventing, you are going to need a very rich forage to get enough calories in that horse, because they may need 30,000 calories a day. So you might have to go to a legume-based hay, alfalfa, versus something that's super thrifty that only needs 15,000 kilocalories. You're going to want a mature, low-calorie hay that they can just nibble on, and they're not going to get huge from. Maybe even something that's pretty mature where it's not super soft and they really have to chew it. That would be great as well. So keep that in mind. I know a lot of horse people, especially if they have small programs, just want the best thing for the horses. And sometimes that is expensive second cutting, which isn't always the best option if you have a really easy keeping horse. Grazing muzzles are super helpful to combat that seasonality issue with the pastures. And then anything you can do if the horse is currently overweight to help with the metabolism and keeping that metabolism up is also going to really work in your favor. So daily movement, turning them out in bigger pastures, walkers, all super helpful. And then, 30 minutes of trotting, cantering, a little bit of heavier work, which we in nutrition consider that to be the heart rate. So heavy work is not necessarily the difficulty of the work, it's the actual heart rate of the animal while it's in work. Because at low level of heart rate, the animal can use fat as a calorie source and as an energy source. Once the heart rate goes above a certain level, then it can only use carbohydrates. And so you do have to have some carbohydrates on board. And the more cardiovascular work that horse is doing, the longer duration of it, the more carbohydrates that horse needs in its diet to convert into glycogen for energy and muscle recovery. Protein is not an energy source. Protein is not converted to energy in the body. So feeding a high protein diet is not going to make your horse hot. Fiber also does not convert very well into energy for the most part. The only fiber that does a really good job at that is beet pulp. And so that would be considered kind of a super fiber, and that could be used as energy in the horse. So your fats and your carbohydrates are your two energy sources, and that's going to give you kind of the gas pedal, so to speak, when you consider work and how the horse is managed. Amino acids. So we talk about protein. Protein is made up of amino acids, and protein quality can vary greatly in horse feed and in horse rations. So plant proteins can vary greatly in their bioavailability, and soy, okay, let's take the hormonal piece out for a second. Soy is actually a very highly bioavailable protein source for horses. That's why it's used, and it's also not that expensive. If you have a gelding, I wouldn't worry about it at all. And it's a very different conversation when you're talking about soy in humans versus soy in horses, because although soy is used in a lot of concentrates, like I said, because of the bioavailability and the expense piece of it, your concentrate total amount of the ration for the day is actually a very low percentage. So the amount of soy that horse is getting is not going to be enough to cause any kind of hormonal problem or metabolic problem in the horse, unlike humans, where if you're eating processed food, you might be eating large quantities of soy specifically soy as the total ration in your diet. Horses are getting forage, no soy, tiny bit of concentrates, only part of that concentrate is soy. Humans could be eating soy in every single meal at high levels. So with that being said, synthetic amino acids are also really important, especially if the manufacturer uses a low quality plant protein. That synthetic amino acid will help with all of these different body structures. So that protein is there as a building block. That's where you're gonna repair tendons, build muscle, have a high quality hair and hoof, skin, and strong bones. So important for breeding. And Margaret can tell you that her Cleveland Bay just completely dappled out, looked amazing when we focused on the amino acids in his diet. So this is more just general feeding guidelines for the workload. So again, this is what we're looking at, workload. You could also consider work in breeding stallions as well. Like some breeding stallions could be in very heavy work when they're in season. It's cardiovascular work, and you want to look at the exercise levels. So how high is this heart rate going? How long is it going for? And tailor the diet to that. So, added calorie for heavy exercise, making sure that you've got the really high quality protein sources with fortified amino acids, whey protein, soy proteins, moderate starch and sugar from highly digestible sources. So oats, barley, corn, not a super digestible source for starch and sugar, also spikes the blood sugar quite badly, which means it also crashes it. And then you want to look at a wide range of vitamins and minerals just to help support basically the rebounding from the workload. Digestive enzymes could help with utilization of the feedstuffs that you're giving it. Pre and probiotics is going to help with the hindgut and the immune system, and also with stress. And then the acid buffering, that's been put into horse feeds over the last maybe 7 years. You've started to see acid buffering products come into horse feeds to help aid with gastric ulcers. So Tums is basically what most of the manufacturers are using. You're not going to fix gastric ulcers with horse feed, just saying. And then light and moderate exercise. This is where you really want to focus more on having your calorie be fat-based, because that's what they're going to use first. They don't need a whole lot of starch and sugar. So controlled starch and sugars, and watching out for sources that create excitability when they're not naturally burning it off. And antioxidants, pre and probiotics, super helpful. Light and moderate exercise that also includes a pretty low stress lifestyle, right? So if the horse is turned out and is running the fields all day, running the fence line, weaving in its stall, it's going to burn off a lot of calories doing that. And it's going to also have a lot of stress in the body doing that. So that's where you want to look at more of keeping the antioxidants and inflammation in the body down in general. I think I'm pretty much at 30 minutes at this